December 22nd, 1944. 11:30 a.m., Bastogne, Belgium. Frost filmed every surface, and each breath climbed into the air like a small white flag of its own. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Card watched 4 German officers step out of the trees and onto the snow-packed road, a stark strip of white cloth held high against a landscape chewed to pieces. They advanced with practiced calm, bearing a typed message that arrived not as a request, but as a verdict. The phrasing took on the chill of the day. The fortune of war is changing. The USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation: honorable surrender. They waited with the assurance of men who believed arithmetic had already decided the outcome. And by the numbers, the case seemed open and shut. Roughly 18,000 Americans held a shrinking ring against some 30,000 German troops supported by hundreds of tanks. No supply line fed the pocket. The sky, locked under steel-grey weather, denied Allied aircraft. Relief was distant by more than 100 meters. There was, to all appearances, no corridor and no hope. What those officers could not see from the edge of the Bastogne perimeter was the other calculation unfolding far to the south. 130 miles below the siege line, General George S. Patton had committed himself to a promise that sounded more like a dare than a plan. He pledged to wrench an entire field army out of its current axis, pivot it through winter-strangled roads, and drive it toward the ring around Bastogne at a speed no staff textbook had ever endorsed. The battlefield's math, force ratios, road nets, tonnage, mileage, would be stressed to the breaking point by a collision between German certainty and American refusal, and by a commander determined to make impossible a temporary condition rather than a conclusion. The chain of events that set up this moment had begun 6 days earlier, in a darkness that was not just the absence of light, but the deliberate concealment of an army. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 a.m., the Ardennes forest erupted. Along an 80-mile front, 1,600 German artillery pieces tore open the morning, shells stitching through the frozen air into American positions that had grown used to the idea that the enemy was spent. Private First Class Robert Leckie of the 99th Infantry Division captured it in a diary line like a seismograph needle. The earth shook, trees disintegrated into splinters, the very air screamed. They had been told the Germans were finished. They had been told wrong. The operation bore a name whose intent was as clear as its secrecy. Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last heavy throw to reverse a war that had turned against him. In the lead-up, the Wehrmacht moved like a ghost army. 10,000 troops, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and 2,600 artillery pieces threaded the dense Eifel forests, mostly at night. Radio silence held. Horses hauled supplies where engines might betray them. General Major Heinz Kokott of the 26th Volks Grenadier Division noted the human stillness before the blast-off, men exhaling vapors into the cold, feeling the scale of what hung in the balance. Not another probe, a final wager. The target was calculated with clinical logic. The Allied line bulged across nasty ground, thinly held by 4 American divisions, many new to combat, the rest catching their breath after earlier fights. The strike achieved what German planning needed most: tactical surprise. By mid-morning, some sectors had already collapsed, others were peeling back in disorder. Units lost contact. Roads clogged with vehicles heading away from a front that, minute by minute, seemed to be leaping forward. But for all of the fire and momentum, the German plan was not built merely on impact. It was built on speed. Bastogne was the key. The road junction, 7 major routes braided together, was a gate through which armor could surge toward the larger prize, the port of Antwerp, 125 miles farther on. Without Bastogne in hand within 48 hours, the offensive would choke on its own congestion. On the German side, Responsibility for this capture fell to General de Pan's Tropen Hinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz and the 47th Panzer Corps. His order of battle offered muscle enough to fill a map. The elite 2nd Panzer Division with 88 tanks and assault guns, the veteran Panzerlehr Division with 57 more, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division bringing 17,000 infantry to seal cracks and secure ground. Racing toward the same streets and crossroads from the opposite direction were men who had been trying to remember what warm felt like. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, had been resting in Rams, France after 72 straight days in Holland. Rest ended with a sentence: grab your weapons and get on the trucks. Winter gear could wait, the road could not. December 17th, 900 p.m. The temperature slid to 14 degrees F as the first trucks began their crawl eastward. Private Donald Burgett of the 56th Parachute Infantry Regiment later recalled the convoy as if it moved through a wind tunnel of warnings. Endless files of American soldiers streamed the other way, retreating, some without weapons, some without helmets, all with voices raised to the passing trucks. "Go back. They'll kill you all." One soldier, eyes outsize with fear, clamped a hand on Burgett's sleeve and blurted, "Thousands of them. Tigers, panthers, everything." Burgett shook him off. They were not turning around. The column stretched like a steel spine across the night. 380 trucks pushing the division toward a battle whose outlines were still a rumor. Maps were scarce, intelligence mixed and muddy. The only firm instruction was the simplest and hardest: reach Bastogne first. On paper, the 101st brought weight: 85 officers and 11,035 enlisted men, for a total of 11,140. 4 infantry regiments, 5,001st, 5,002nd, 56th Parachute Infantry, and the 327th Glider Infantry, anchored the formation, backed by 4 artillery battalions and the web of support, without which a division is just a name. They were not the first Americans to put a blocking hand across the northern approaches. Team de Zuber, a combat team from the 10th Armored Division under Major William de Sudbury, had already clawed into position at Nov, 3 miles north of Bastogne, and hardened into a roadblock. At dawn on December 19th, the fog sat on the ground so thick it almost had weight. Through that shroud they heard power before they saw it: the low, steady growl of German armor. Sergeant William McCloskey, tank commander with Team Dory, described the first shapes materializing out of the mist. A panther at close range looked less like a machine than a bad omen. The Sherman's 75mm rounds sparked and slid off its slabbed front armor. Survival demanded patience and nerve, holding fire until the enemy lurched close enough to offer a flank. The fight for Noville lasted the day, and then some, a balance beam between a handful of American tanks and the mass of the 2nd Panzer Division. Team Deseri, just 15 Shermans, stood on the line long enough to wreck 31 German tanks across 48 hours before orders pulled them back. Major Desri paid for those hours in blood. A German shell shredded his command post and left him severely wounded. But the time he bought could not be extracted from the German schedule. By December 20th, a new signature appeared on orders in Bastogne. Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe, an artilleryman known for quiet steadiness, took temporary command of the 101st while Maxwell Taylor was in Washington. The map in his headquarters reduced the battlefield to arrows and symbols, but the picture was blunt. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division pressed from the south and east. Panzerlehr shoved from the east. Tendrils of the 2nd Panzer Division probed from the north. At noon, the last intact road, the highway to Neufchâteau, was cut. The pocket had become a bowl. Along the perimeter, Captain Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506 PIR, put his men into the ground itself. Foxholes bit into soil that might as well have been stone. When entrenching tools snapped, helmets and bare hands took over. From beyond the line, tracks clanked and engines idled like predators pacing. The mercury hung near zero. Feet, blackened with frostbite. Inside the town, about 3,000 civilians retreated to cellars as German artillery began to peel Bastogne apart, building by building. In the aid station on Runos Chateau, a 30-year-old Belgian nurse, Renée Lammermeyer, worked without pause over American and German wounded alike. She would not outlive the siege. The defenders inside the ring now tallied to roughly 18,000. The 101st's 11,140 carried the bulk. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division under Colonel William Roberts added around 2,800 men and about 40 operational tanks. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion brought its M18 Hellcats to the hunt. The all-African-American 9/16th Artillery Battalion and other supporting units thickened the fire. The weather, beginning December 21st, lowered another lid. Visibility fell under 100 yards, snow braided with fog until movement itself risked vanishing. A U.S. Army meteorological note called the conditions extremely adverse for military operations, which translated differently on each side of the line. Oberstleutnant von Lau of the 2nd Panzer Division recognized an ally in the sky. Without Allied fighter bombers, he noted, the Americans became just men, and the Germans had more tanks. But the storm punished everybody. Alternate freeze and thaw turned ground to glue, then glass. Engines drank fuel at double rates. Supply trucks slewed and jackknifed. Wounded men died of cold before medicine could reach them. Inside the pocket, every measure shrank. Ammunition rationed down to 10 rounds per artillery piece per day. With the medical company captured on December 19th, morphine had to be husbanded for only the worst cases. Food dwindled to 1 meal daily. Private First Class James Sims remembered melting snow for water, remembered a medic cutting boots off a friend and taking toes with them. No tears, just the blankness of pain beyond feeling. While Bastogne tightened, a very different scene took shape 130 miles south at Verdun on December 19th. In a damp barracks warmed by a stubborn pot-bellied stove, Dwight D. Eisenhower gathered his commanders, Bernard Montgomery, Omar Bradley, George S. Patton, around a table and an intelligence briefing that described a rupture rather than a dent. After the last chart, silence pressed down until Eisenhower broke it with an instruction dressed as an attitude. This was an opportunity, not a disaster. Only cheerful faces at this table. Patton, irrepressible, tossed out a provocation. Let them run to Paris, then cut them off and chew them up. But Eisenhower's ask cut through the gallows humor. Attack north. How fast can you pivot toward Bastogne? Patton's reply drew a laugh and then a rebuke. 3 divisions, 48 hours. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tadar chuckled at the audacity. Eisenhower warned against fatuousness and warned of piecemeal ruin. But Patton wasn't guessing. For 3 days, Colonel Oscar Coe, his operations architect, had been tapping him on the shoulder about the German buildup in the Ardennes. Contingency plans were already sketched in detail. Fuel dumps and ammunition caches had been pre-positioned along possible northern routes. Medical units had been shifted like chess pieces onto squares that might suddenly matter. Patton unfolded a map and talked Eisenhower through his intent. Milliken's 3rd Corps would jump. 4th armored in the lead, then the 26th and 810th Infantry Divisions. The axis would run through Ireland and drive to Bastogne. Eisenhower looked at the distances, considered the iced roads and blind turns, measured risk against necessity. When can you start? December 22nd morning. Do it. Exiting the room, Patton sent the signal. Play ball. 2 words and 133,000 vehicles began to nose north. The Third Army, 250,000 men, swung like a door on a frozen hinge. Supply dumps faced the wrong direction for Germany. They had to be hauled, restacked, relaid. 20,000 mi of telephone wire would have to be rerun. Artillery firing tables recalculated for a front that had spun 90 degrees. At 7:00 p.m. on December 19th, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, took the mission like a dare. 150 miles in 19 hours through a blizzard. Blackout lights, tank commanders half standing in their turrets to guide drivers who could not see a road so much as sense it. Men fell asleep on their feet. Others shook them awake. Sherman tanks gulped 175 gallons each for the haul, 50,000 gallons just to get a division to the start line. Fuel trucks ran until they slid off into ditches. Then fuel moved by 5-gallon jerry cans, hand to hand. Master Sergeant Frank Carousel and maintenance crews worked 72 hours straight, changing track blocks on the crawl. Skin froze to steel, skin tore. No one stopped. Somewhere ahead, paratroopers in Bastogne were counting on the sound of engines. Back at the pocket, the ring drew tighter. The perimeter shrank under pressure to less than 16 miles. German artillery found and refound every strong point until the ground itself seemed mapped by explosions. Aid stations overflowed, and so the 4 officers under the white flag came at 11:30 a.m. on December 22nd to deliver the ultimatum typed on 2 sheets, one English, one German. The English bang-hammered on an English typewriter with German diacritics inked in. F Company, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, escorted them inward. Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps, Lieutenant Helmuth Henke from Panzer Operations, and 2 enlisted men from the 9001st Panzer Grenadier Regiment formed the party. The message traveled quickly to the basement where General McAuliffe, grabbing minutes of sleep, was shaken awake by Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, the Germans' wanted terms. McAuliffe's first word, unfiltered, was the one that would outlive the siege. Nuts. He read the full text aloud to his staff. It forecast annihilation under German guns and offered surrender as the only honorable reprieve. When Colonel Moore asked what reply should go back, McAuliffe hesitated only long enough to let the room breathe. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Card prompted him. "What you said first will be hard to beat." McAuliffe smiled, then wrote the answer that would be quoted across decades. To the German commander, nuts. The American commander, Colonel Joseph Harper, delivered it. The German officers blinked at the oddity of the word. "Nuts? What does this mean?" Harper translated without ornament. "Go to hell," and added the postscript that if they attacked again, the killing would be done in the other direction. Major Wagner stiffened into the ritual. "We will kill many Americans." Harper's exit line was as flat as the winter road. "On your way, bud. And good luck to you." The formal demand had never enjoyed the blessing of General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army. He later admitted as much. Yet once issued and refused, the exchange hardened both sides. The Luftwaffe came that evening with its first heavy bombing of Bastogne, turning foxholes into coffins and the town into a storm of splinters and sparks. For the men on the line, the night became a long lesson in endurance, taking turns sleeping to keep from freezing to death, using ration cans rather than stepping into the open, learning how exposure meant frostbite or a sniper's crack. Food shrank to a single Kiar ration a day, about 2,800 calories when the cold demanded far more. Waxed cardboard from ration boxes became precious, enough burn to make water from snow. Technical Sergeant Donald Malarkey found meat where no one wanted to look. Dead German horses, frozen and therefore fresh. Bayonets hacked steaks from carcasses. Fires made from broken ammunition boxes did the rest. It tasted like defeat and survival at once, and it kept men alive. By then, the clock that Germany had set for itself, 48 hours to Bastogne, had already run out. The siege tightened, the weather stayed cruel, and far to the south, an army's pivot gathered into motion. Chapter 2. Sky Break, Steel Storm. The ring around Bastogne constricted like a tourniquet while, far to the south, Patton's promise turned into motion you could measure in fuel drums and frozen knuckles. Playball had lit a fuse across the length of 3rd Army. Convoys ground their way north. headlights blacked out to thin slits, drivers steering by instinct, and the ghost-pale suggestion of roadside ditches. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams and the 37th Tank Battalion took the order at 7:00 p.m. on December 19th and drove into a night that never seemed to end. 150 mish were 19 hours through sleet that stabbed skin and turned metal to ice. Tank commanders rode half-exposed, guiding men who could not see a road so much as feel it under treads. Sleep ambushed soldiers on their feet. Sergeants shook them awake by the shoulders and pushed them back into the cold. The sums were brutal. Each Sherman thirsted for 175 gallons just to reach the start line. The division would need 50,000 gallons for the jump alone. Fuel trucks skated off cambered, icy roads, and when engines died, the lifeblood moved by hand in 5-gallon jerry cans, a relay in snow and darkness. Master Sergeant Frank Carousel's maintenance crews worked 72 hours without a full night's rest, swapping track blocks on tanks that never fully stopped rolling, hands bonded to frozen steel. Skin came away when men pulled free. Yet the column kept crawling. In the pocket ahead, paratroopers were counting down ammunition, calories, and hours. Inside Bastogne, the perimeter shrank to less than 16 meters. German guns mapped every strong point to the yard. Shells probed, adjusted, and returned. Aid stations overflowed into hallways and cellars. The 4 emissaries with the white flag had already been sent packing with a single word: nuts. And that defiance drew retaliation from the Luftwaffe on the evening of December 22nd, their bombs battering foxholes and turning streets into raked coals of splintered beams and masonry. Survival turned practical and small. Men shared a single KR ration per day, 2,800 calories in a climate that demanded twice that. Wax-coated ration cardboard became fuel to melt snow into water. Technical Sergeant Donald Malarkey and others found meat where conditions forced them to look. Dead German horses, frozen hard and therefore unspoiled. Bayonets hacked steaks. Fires built from broken ammunition boxes did the cooking. It tasted of iron and necessity. At Verdun 3 days earlier, Eisenhower had made a choice that gave the siege its counter-movement. The German breakthrough would be treated as a chance, not a calamity. Patton's staff work, laid quietly over 3 days of warnings from Colonel Oscar Coe, meant the pivot wasn't improvised, but triggered. Fuel dumps had been pre-positioned, medical units and ammunition points set to swing. Even 20,000 mi of telephone wire were scouted for a 90-degree turn of the front. The map's new geometry took shape across frozen crossroads and bottlenecks that could have strangled any lesser attempt. Then weather, tyrant and ally, made up its mind. December 23rd came in like a window thrown open. After 7 straight days of fog and snow, the sky cleared to a crystalline sheet. The temperature crept above freezing. Visibility threw its arms wide to 10 mares. At 9:50 a.m., the first Pathfinder aircraft swept above Bastogne, painting the air with colored smoke to mark drop zones. Private radios caught the rising purr of engines. By 11:50 a.m., the rumble had become a layered roar as 241 C-47s stacked into orderly lines over the embattled town. Sergeant Jack Agnew of the Pathfinder team remembered popping purple smoke and looking up to a sky that darkened with wings. A sight so beautiful and improbable that men climbed out of foxholes to cheer, helmets waved in mittened hands, tears cutting clean tracks down grit-streaked faces. For 7 days they had been alone. Now the sky itself seemed to lean down and help. At 11:55 a.m., parachutes flowered, white and color, over the snowfields. Bundles thumped and skidded across ice, and men sprinted through artillery fire to recover them, each package a handful of hours added to the pocket's life. Ammunition, bandages, morphine where any remained, blankets, food, and more than anything, artillery shells that turned thin lines into walls. Out of 1,446 bundles, 95% were recovered. Captain James Parker of the 101st G4 watched a private take shrapnel, stagger up, and haul a bundle to cover with blood striping his face, then go back for another. The price was paid in the air, too. German anti-aircraft guns ringed the town, and C-47s, forced to fly straight and level at 1,000 FT for accuracy, offered targets that could not jink. Still they came, day after day. By December 26th, aircraft had delivered 120.7 tons by parachute and 92.4 tons by glider. The largest effort hit on December 26th, when 289 planes flew the Boston run, bringing in the weight that turned endurance into resistance. The enemy answered in its own way. At 2:45 a.m. on December 25th, Christmas morning bared its teeth. German artillery laid down the heaviest barrage of the siege, a 2-hour concussion that rattled foxholes and crushed the edges of men's patience. Then, at 5:30 a.m., 18 Panzer Mark V tanks of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, draped in white camouflage infantry, hit the western perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel Wolfgang Mahler led the thrust, carrying General Kokot's order like a verdict. Bastogne must fall today. The Führer's Christmas wish wrapped in armor. Company A, 327th Glider Infantry, took the first hit and was driven in. Private First Class Kenneth Hendris, waiting in the second line, felt the ground quake as engines rolled closer. In the grey-blue smear of dawn, the tanks seemed less like machines than a line of predators. Bazooka rounds skittered off armor, yet the Americans had set their counter carefully. The M18 Hellcats of the 75th Tank Destroyer Battalion were tucked into the smashed skeletons of buildings, muzzles angled to the flanks. Sergeant Bill Harper let the panzers pass, counted heartbeats, then ordered fire into the softer armor at the rear. His gunner, Corporal Johnson, made 5 shots into 3 kills, the barrel cycling smoke and heat into the freezing air. By 1000 a.m., all 18 German tanks burned, black smoke coiling upward, and nearly 400 German soldiers lay in the snow. A captured officer's acknowledgement was a quiet seal on a failed push. Your defense was magnificent. After this morning, we knew we could not take Bastogne. McAuliffe's Christmas message threaded the perimeter soon after. He recounted the surrender demand and the single-word answer, then steadied the line with a simple clause. We have stopped cold everything thrown at us from north, east, south, and west. On that day of ritual and reflection, men ate what they had, some a full ration for the first time in a week, others a split tin shared with a buddy, and checked ammunition, field dressings, and the thin insulation between their feet and a deepening frost. Relief surged closer, but the road from the south still paid out its yards like coins. The 4th Armored Division had gained only 7 Tatmatos in 3 days through ground that seemed to resist wheels and treads by force of will. Patton, impatient with obstacles that could not be shot at, called in the only specialist left to consult. On December 22nd, he asked his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, to issue a prayer. Good weather, fair skies for battle, a chance to drive without mud and fog and snow as enemies. O'Neill joked about the thickness of the rug required. Patton retorted that a flying carpet would do. The prayer went to 250,000 soldiers on pocket-sized cards. Whether by divine answer or fortunate shift in air masses, December 23rd delivered what was asked. And every day after, the sky kept making up for lost time. Not all gifts came without blood. On Christmas Eve at 8:30 p.m., the Luftwaffe returned and punched a hole through the center of Bastogne. One bomb struck the aid station where René Lammermeyer had been working since the first shells fell. The blast collapsed the building into a low hill of boards and beams and dust. Corporal Kenneth Moore got there in time to hear voices from underneath, men calling for help, some calling for their mothers. He and others clawed at rubble with bare hands until fingers bled. They pulled out living and dead. Miss Lammermeyer was among the 30 Americans who did not rise from the wreckage. Augusta Chewy, a Congolese-Belgian nurse, survived and worked for 30 hours straight thereafter, moving through the wards like a metronome that refused to slow. Behind the perimeter, artillery crews measured their resupply in hope and fire. The new shells made possible the kind of response that could break an attack before it cohered. Along the foxholes, men rotated in and out of brief sleep to keep frostbite from finishing what the enemy began. They learned tricks that kept life in fingers and toes, urinating in cans to avoid exposing themselves, while snipers watched for any sudden silhouette. Each hour survived felt like a small victory. By the end of December 24th, the story had begun to tilt. The sky belonged to the Allies more hours than not. Supplies reached into Bastogne with reliable mass. The western perimeter still held, harder now than a week earlier. And from the south, the growl of 4th Armored's advance had become a constant, low thunder. The siege was not ended, but its outcome had shifted from arithmetic to will, German overconfidence contending with American determination, with Patton's audacity supplying the lever. Chapter 3. The Breakthrough. December 26, 1944. The dawn cracked pale and hard over the Ardennes. Frost rimed the barrels of rifles and the edges of helmets. For the men of Bastogne, it was the 12th day of the siege, a span so heavy it felt like a lifetime. Every hour before sunrise brought the same pattern. Shells whispering through the air, the brittle sound of branches snapping under tank treads, and then, as the light grew, silence broken only by the clink of a bayonet against a canteen or the muffled cough of a soldier conserving warmth. At 2:45 a.m., the Germans fired their most violent artillery barrage yet. The bombardment rolled across the perimeter like an unbroken tide, thousands of shells pounding the snow, lighting the night in orange flashes. The ground seemed to inhale and exhale under the concussion. After 2 hours, when the noise finally began to thin, something worse came with the silence. 18 Mark V Panther tanks of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, backed by waves of infantry in white camouflage. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Wolfgang Mähler, carried orders signed by General Kokott himself. Bastogne must fall today. It is the Führer's Christmas wish. The Panthers rumbled forward through mist, their turrets scanning like blind eyes. The first line of foxholes, held by Company A of the 327th Glider Infantry, was smashed aside. Private First Class Kenneth Hendris crouched in the second line, his bazooka clutched in numb hands. Through the freezing haze, the German tanks loomed closer, monstrous and slow, their tracks grinding frozen earth into smoke. Bazooka rounds sparked and bounced off armor that seemed invincible. Then, from among the shattered buildings of the town, the hidden American answer spoke. The M18 Hellcats of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion waited for the moment when the tanks passed and exposed their thinner armor. Sergeant Bill Harper's crew had been silent for hours, engine off, fingers pressed to cold triggers. When the lead Panther crawled past, Harper whispered, "Now!" The gunner, Corporal Johnson, fired once, twice, 5 times. 3 tanks went up in flame. The Hellcats shifted and fired again from new angles, fast and low. The air filled with the smell of fuel and burnt paint. By 10 o'clock that morning, all 18 German tanks were burning wrecks, black smoke pouring upward in columns visible for miles. Nearly 400 German soldiers lay dead in the snow. Later that day, a captured German officer, his face gray with exhaustion, told his interrogators, "Your defense was magnificent. After this morning, we knew we could not take Bastogne." Inside the town, McAuliffe released a Christmas message that circulated on mimeographed sheets. It began with the German ultimatum and ended with his own laconic courage. "We have stopped cold everything that has been thrown at us from the north, east, south, and west." The note spread hand to hand, warming the men more than their rations could. Far to the south, Patton's spearheads were still fighting their way through miles of white mud and ambush. The advance had crawled only 7 miles in 3 days. To some, the relief of Bastogne looked impossible. To Patton, the word still meant only a challenge. His 4th Armored Division, led by Abrams, had spent the nights clawing north through shattered villages where every intersection was mined, every ditch a potential trap. Tank commanders slept in their turrets, engineers walked point in waist-deep snow, probing the ground with bayonets. At one crossroads, entire convoys halted while engineers repaired a bridge under fire. Patton's voice on the field radios was relentless. "Keep driving. No one ever won a war by digging in." Behind the lines, his logistics officers performed miracles of arithmetic and desperation. They diverted fuel columns by the hour, rerouted ammunition trains, and laid new telephone lines across ice-bound fields. Patton himself prowled his command posts, watching reports pinwheel in. "If we can't fly, we'll drive," he growled. "If we can't drive, we'll walk." By December 24th, the road from Arlon to Bastogne had become a single line of motion. Trucks, half-tracks, tanks, all creeping through a night lit only by the glow of engines. One sergeant compared it to an iron river cutting north through the snow. Meanwhile, inside Bastogne, life had taken on the rhythm of endurance. The men learned to live like animals in burrows, sleeping in shifts, melting snow for water, and keeping their boots on at all times to prevent frostbite from stealing their toes in the night. Some wrote letters they knew would never be mailed. Others scrawled prayers into the margins of field manuals. A few, tougher, luckier, still found humor in misery. One paratrooper carved Hotel Bastogne, no vacancy, into a wooden sign and nailed it to a ruined wall. Then came Christmas Eve, a night of both miracle and tragedy. The weather cleared, and for the first time in a week, the Allied planes returned in strength. C-47s swept over the town, parachutes opening like blossoms in the sky, carrying ammunition, food, and medicine. Men ran through shellfire to recover the bundles, laughing, shouting, crying. It was the first tangible proof that they had not been forgotten. But just as hope began to lift, the Luftwaffe struck back. At 8:30 p.m., German bombers appeared overhead. One of their bombs fell directly on the aid station, where the Belgian nurse, Renée Lemaire, had been tending the wounded since the siege began. The explosion leveled the building. Corporal Kenneth Moore, working nearby, rushed to the ruins. All that was left was rubble, he remembered later. We could hear men crying beneath it, calling for help, calling for their mothers. We dug until our hands bled. 30 Americans and Lemaire herself died in the blast. Her surviving colleague, Augusta Chiwi, treated the wounded for 30 hours straight without rest. For the men who lived through that night, the smell of fire and antiseptic never left their memories. When dawn came on Christmas morning, Patton's men attacked again. The ground was frozen steel, their breath hung in the air like smoke from gun barrels. German resistance stiffened, but the Americans moved forward, mile by mile, house by house. Every hedgerow seemed to hide an anti-tank gun, every field an ambush. Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion led the advance, pushing through towns whose names blurred together in the cold. Martelange, Warnac, Chaumont. Each village was taken, lost, and retaken. By December 26th, the tip of Abrams' spear reached the outskirts of Assenois, 4 miles south of Bastogne. The final barrier between the trapped 101st Airborne and the onrushing 3rd Army was a series of fortified farmhouses bristling with German guns. Abrams ordered artillery support so heavy that even his staff thought he was joking. "I want every gun you've got," he radioed. Within minutes, 2,140 shells fell on the German positions. Lieutenant Charles Boggs, commanding the lead Sherman tank, Cobra King, watched the barrage through his periscope. "The whole town seemed to lift off the ground," he said. Then we charged. At 2:20 p.m., the tanks roared forward, guns blazing. Infantry followed, firing from the hips, shouting above the din. Private James Hendris, bowgunner in Cobra King, said later, "We went through that town like a hot knife through butter. Germans were shooting from windows, from doorways, from cellars. We fired point blank." At 4:50 p.m., Cobra King crested a small rise, and Boggs saw a cluster of American soldiers waving ahead, the engineers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, holding the outer edge of Bastogne. "Come on in," they shouted. "You're the first tanks we've seen in 10 days. Boggs grabbed the radio and called it in. Contact with friendly forces established. The siege of Bastogne was broken. General McAuliffe received the news with characteristic restraint. "We're glad to see you, boys," he said simply. But for the soldiers in the foxholes, restraint was impossible. Men fired rifles into the air in joy. Wounded soldiers in the aid stations wept and cheered. Even those too weak to stand smiled as the rumble of Sherman engines rolled through the snow. The cost had been savage. Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion lost 5 killed, 22 wounded, and 5 missing in the final assault. The 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion lost 30 killed and nearly 200 wounded. Yet the corridor, barely 400 yards wide, was open. For the Germans, the blow was more than physical. General Major Kokot recorded in his diary, "The relief of Bastogne is a disaster, not only tactically but morally. Our soldiers no longer believe in victory. They have seen American determination, and it has broken their spirit." Lieutenant Kaufmann of the Panzer Lehr Division was even blunter. "We threw everything we had at Bastogne, our best troops, our last tanks, and they laughed at us. Nuts!" That single word had become a symbol, more devastating to German morale than any bomb. Chapter 4. Turning the Tide. By the morning of December 27th, the siege of Bastogne had officially ended, but the wider battle still thundered across the Ardennes. The relief column had opened a narrow wound in the German line, and now Patton intended to drive it wider with the blunt force of momentum. South of the town, engines rumbled day and night as new units poured through the corridor, widening it to a mile, then 2. Smoke drifted low over the snowfields, mingling with the fog that never seemed to leave the forest. The men of the 101st Airborne, who had fought for every foot of ground for 10 days, finally exhaled. The first order of business was survival. Medics emerged from cellars blinking in the pale light, carrying the wounded toward field hospitals, hastily assembled from tents and shattered buildings. For some, it was their first real warmth in weeks. The doctors worked without pause. They had operated through the siege using candlelight when the generators failed, cognac from Belgian homes when the morphine ran out. Major René Bowman, chief surgeon of the 101st, had performed 167 operations in 10 days. Now, with supplies finally arriving, he and his team moved from triage to miracles, rebuilding shattered limbs, saving men who had been written off as lost. The air over Bastogne, once a grey lid, turned clear and cold. The change brought not just sunlight, but the full, vengeful return of Allied air power. Between December 23rd and 27, the skies filled with aircraft, P-47 Thunderbolts, Tempests, and Typhoons, sweeping low over the forests in what pilots nicknamed tank plinking. Flight Lieutenant Pierre Klosterman of the Royal Air Force described it as hunting steel in daylight. From 8,000 feet, they dove almost vertically, loosing rockets at 2,000 feet before pulling out in sharp arcs. Below them, the frozen woods flashed with the light of burning armor. The statistics of retribution were staggering. From December 23rd to 27, Allied planes flew more than 34,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe, which had entered the offensive with roughly 2,000 operational aircraft, was reduced to fewer than 300. On December 26th alone, 294 Lancaster bombers from the RAF smashed German positions around Saint-Vith, dropping 1,140 tons of high explosives. Every road for 3 kilometers in any direction was obliterated. Unteroffizier Hans Barons of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division crawled out of the wreckage and wrote, "The earth itself vanished. Men simply ceased to exist." From his command post in Bastogne, McAuliffe sent a message of gratitude to the 19th Tactical Air Command. "If it had not been for your splendid cooperation, we should never have been able to hold out." By the end of the month, the German offensive, the great Watch on the Rhine, was unraveling. Tanks ran dry on fuel, infantry lines dissolved into exhaustion, and the Wehrmacht's myth of invincibility died in the snow. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, later admitted that the turning point had not been any single defeat, but the failure to take Bastogne when it was within reach. Bastogne, he said in post-war interrogation, was the graveyard of the Ardennes offensive. We needed that road junction by December 18th. When the Americans held for a week, then were reinforced, we knew the offensive had failed. Hitler's dream of splitting the Allied armies and forcing a negotiated peace vanished with it. The Germans had committed 25 divisions, nearly their entire Western Reserve, to the Ardennes. In 6 weeks of fighting, they lost between 81,000 and 98,000 men, more than 600 tanks and assault guns, and over 1,000 aircraft. These were losses the Third Reich could never replace. The Americans paid dearly as well. Across the entire Ardennes front, roughly 75,000 were killed, wounded, or missing. Of these, about 19,000 never came home. But unlike Germany, America could replenish its ranks. By January 1945, new divisions were landing in Europe at the rate of 1 every week. For the soldiers who had survived Bastogne, the relief brought something stranger than victory. Quiet. The silence after days of bombardment felt unnatural, almost unbearable. Men found themselves listening for shells that didn't come, for engines that never arrived. When the first warm meal reached the town, a pot of stew hauled up from an army kitchen truck. Some wept without shame. Others stood and ate in silence, staring at the snow that covered their dead comrades. In the days that followed, the story of the siege spread like wildfire through the Allied ranks. "Nuts!" became a rallying cry, a word scrawled on tanks, jeeps, and helmets. Patton's lightning pivot was studied by officers who had once dismissed him as reckless. What he had accomplished in 72 hours was a logistical feat few thought possible. 250,000 men, 133,000 vehicles, moved over 100 miles in winter without a single major traffic jam. He had created 70 new ammunition depots, 40 fuel dumps containing 500,000 gallons of gasoline, and laid 20,000 miles of wire. Colonel Oscar Koch, Patton's operations chief, later said, "It should have taken 6 days just to plan such a move. Patton did it in 3. Even the Germans, hardened by years of war, found themselves grudgingly impressed. Oberstleutnant Hinrich von Lüttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, the same man who had demanded McAuliffe's surrender, visited the Bastogne Memorial in 1954. He saluted the monument and said, "They were magnificent enemies who became better friends. They fought not for conquest but for principle. That is why they deserved to win." The siege had left Bastogne scarred beyond recognition. The once quiet Belgian town was now a skeleton of shattered stone and blackened timbers. Yet amid the ruin, life flickered stubbornly back to its feet. Belgian civilians emerged from their cellars, blinking in disbelief at the devastation above them. Soldiers helped them dig through rubble for photographs, for tools, for keepsakes that might remind them of who they had been before the war swept through their streets. And in that fragile reconstruction, something remarkable began to form. A sense of kinship between liberator and liberated, enemy and victor. German prisoners worked beside American soldiers to clear the roads. Belgian children, wrapped in oversized army coats, followed Patton's men through the town square, laughing. To the world watching from afar, Bastogne became something larger than a battlefield. It was proof that free men, fighting not for empire, but for each other, could withstand even the worst that tyranny could throw at them. It was, as Winston Churchill would tell Parliament a month later, undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war and an ever-famous American victory. And yet, for the men who had lived through it, the glory never erased the ghosts. Private James Sims wrote to his family weeks later, "We won, but the snow still feels full of voices." The victory had come at a price measured not just in bodies, but in the quiet changes it left behind in those who survived. An unspoken knowledge that courage is less about triumph than endurance. Chapter 5. The Spirit of Bastogne. By early January 1945, the snow around Bastogne was no longer white. It had been churned brown by boots, burned black by fuel, and streaked red where the wounded had fallen. The 101st Airborne Division, once surrounded and outnumbered, now watched as columns of German prisoners trudged past, shivering, silent, eyes lowered. The siege that had begun as a trap had become a legend. In the final days of the Ardennes campaign, Patton's Third Army continued to press north, rolling up the last of the German pockets. The enemy's grand offensive, meant to split the Allied lines and seize Antwerp, collapsed under its own ambition. Hitler had gambled on speed and surprise, but his armies had met something he had not accounted for: the immovable will of men who refused to surrender. By the middle of January, the front had stabilized once again. The weather softened, the snows began to melt into mud. The guns fell silent. What remained were the figures that military historians would study for generations, the hard arithmetic of endurance and sacrifice. American forces in Bastogne had begun with about 18,000 men, 1,140 from the 101st Airborne, the rest from Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and the 969th Artillery Battalion. When the siege lifted, their total casualties stood near 4,500, 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing from the Airborne alone. The 705th, fighting with its quick, open-topped Hellcats, had destroyed 108 German armored vehicles while losing only 17 of its own. The German cost was catastrophic. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division lost more than 60% of its men. Panzer Lehr left 42 tanks smoldering across the fields. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had bypassed Bastogne to drive toward the Meuse River, ran out of fuel just 4 miles short and was annihilated by the US 2nd Armored Division. Across the entire front, Hitler's armies had spent their last strategic reserves. And in the east, on January 12th, the Soviet winter offensive thundered forward against an enemy that could no longer respond. The road to Berlin, once guarded by steel and pride, lay open. For the survivors of Bastogne, however, the end of the siege was not the end of their war. They stayed in their foxholes until January 6th, when the final German counterattacks faded into retreat. The weather that had once been their tormentor now preserved their memory, snow freezing their footprints in place, their makeshift shelters etched in ice. In the months that followed, stories of the siege spread across Europe and back to America. General Eisenhower called it a symbol of American courage under fire. Churchill told Parliament that Bastogne would forever stand as one of the finest American victories. Even Field Marshal Montgomery, rarely generous with praise for his American counterparts, declared, "The Americans at Bastogne wrote one of the greatest chapters in military history." But for the men who had lived it, the tale was simpler. They spoke not of glory, but of duty, of friends who had shared foxholes, rations, and fear. Private Robert Leckie of the 99th Infantry wrote home, "We learned that courage is what you do when you're too cold, too tired, and too scared to think, but you do it anyway." When the war ended, the soldiers of the 101st went home, to farms, to factories, to classrooms. Yet the name Bastogne followed them like a shadow. It appeared in history books, in training manuals, in speeches. But the truest memorial was in Belgium itself. On a hill overlooking the rebuilt town stands the Bastogne Memorial, a star-shaped monument carved with the names of the states whose sons fought and died there. Each December 16th, at precisely 5:30 a.m., the moment the German guns first opened fire in 1944, the bells of Bastogne ring out across the hills. Beneath them, the people gather, lighting candles in the snow. Children climb on the Sherman tank Barracuda, left by the 11th Armored Division, now a playground relic of liberation. Among the returning veterans was Vincent Speranza, the paratrooper who had once carried beer to the wounded during the siege. Decades later, Bastogne's brewery would honor him with a local ale called Airborne. When Speranza returned for the 75th anniversary in 2019, at the age of 96, he raised a glass in the town square. "To the boys who didn't come home," he said. "To the people who never forgot. To freedom." There were others who returned as well. In December 1984, the 40th anniversary of the battle brought former enemies together on Belgian soil. American veterans stood beside old German soldiers, gray-haired now, shaking hands where they had once exchanged fire. General McAuliffe, then 87, spoke to them with the same steady voice he had used in 1944. "We fought here not for conquest, but for freedom. We fought not from hatred, but from duty. And when it was over, we helped rebuild what war had destroyed." Among the Germans was Hans Detmer of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. He looked across the same fields where he had once advanced and said quietly, "I came here as a conqueror in 1944. I return as a friend. The Americans we fought showed us what democracy really means. Not weakness, but strength." Today, the foxholes outside Bastogne remain. Some are preserved exactly as they were, rings of frozen mud and splintered wood. A small plaque marks one of them. It bears a simple inscription, words said by a young paratrooper whose name was lost to history. "They've got us surrounded. The poor bastards." That line, half joke, half prophecy, captured the spirit that saved the town and turned the tide of the war. It was the same spirit that refused to yield when logic demanded surrender, the same stubborn faith that made Patton's promise real and carried the 101st Airborne through hell and out again. In the end, the defense and relief of Bastogne proved a truth greater than any statistic or headline, that free men fighting for each other are stronger than any army fighting for conquest. That determination can outlast despair. That when democracy is cornered, it does not fold. It fights back. The snow melted, the roads reopened, and the armies moved on toward Germany. But Bastogne remained, a scar, a symbol, a promise. The fortress of democracy had held. The arsenal of freedom had triumphed. And in that frozen December of 1944, when the world teetered on the edge of darkness, a single word had answered tyranny and echoed through eternity: nuts.